Hello, welcome to Phantom Homicide, the chilling true crime saga of Mia Zapata.
It really is chilling, and it's a story that unfolds over such a long period. You have this incredibly vibrant life just snuffed out, and then this decade of silence almost before science finally gives an answer.
Absolutely. And to understand the impact, you really have to picture Seattle in the early 90s. Grunge wasn't just music, it was this cultural tidal wave, and Mia Zapata was right there, a central figure.
Definitely, she was 27, the lead singer, the lyricist for the Gits. And she wasn't just a singer, she had this raw, powerful voice. People compared her to legends like Billie Holiday, Bessie Smith, but filtered through this uh, punk rock energy.
Yeah, the Gits weren't just another band jumping on the bandwagon, they were critically acclaimed. Their first album, Frenching the Bully, it got serious attention. They were genuinely poised for a major breakthrough, international stardom seemed almost certain.
People who saw them live talk about how Mia just commanded the stage. Steve Moriarty, their drummer, he said audiences would get so mesmerized by her singing they'd almost forget the rest of the band was even there. She had that kind of presence.
Incredible. But then, July 6, 1993, everything changes. We're in Capitol Hill, Seattle. It's this hub, buzzing with musicians, artists, late night bars.
Right. And Mia starts her evening, like many musicians might, at the Comet Tavern. It was a regular spot for her, drinking with friends.
So let's trace those last known hours carefully. She's at the Comet.
Until about 1 a.m., then she leaves, crosses the street. There's an apartment above a rehearsal studio where a friend lived, someone known in the records just as TV.
She stopped at the studio downstairs first, briefly.
Yeah, she popped in there quickly before heading up to TV's apartment.
Okay, and this is where her emotional state becomes really important, right? Sources say she wasn't just drinking, she was apparently quite intoxicated, but also angry.
Deeply angry, yeah. And frustrated. She was actively looking for her ex-boyfriend, Robert Jenkins. She wanted to confront him, sort things out about their relationship, which sounds like it was pretty complicated.
That anger, that specific focus on Jenkins, that's a detail that the defense lawyers would later really latch onto, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It became a cornerstone of their alternate suspect theory.
Mm.
But we'll get into that. For now, Mia's upset. She's looking for Jenkins. She's at TV's place.
Until about 2 a.m.
Right. Around 2 a.m., she tells TV she's going home. She leaves the apartment, heads out on foot. TV recalled her saying she was planning to grab a cab. Mia didn't drive.
And her place wasn't incredibly far, but walking alone at 2 a.m., still, she intended to get a cab.
That was the plan mentioned, yes. But what happened between her leaving that apartment around 2 a.m. and 3:30 a.m., that 90-minute window? It's just a void.
A void that ends with the most unthinkable discovery. About 3:30 a.m., the Seattle Fire Department gets a call.
Yeah. They find Mia's body. Not hidden, just lying on the pavement of this quiet, dead-end residential street, 24th Avenue South. It's about a mile and a half, maybe a bit more, from where she was last seen leaving TV's.
Pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Just gone.
So that's the setup. A beloved artist on the cusp of fame, brutally murdered, and the mystery hangs heavy for years. Our goal here is to really unpack how this happened and how investigators, helped by the community, clung to this one tiny, almost invisible clue.
A clue that survived 10 years in an evidence locker. It's incredible.
It really is. Which brings us into the immediate aftermath, the crime scene itself, Section 1. The brutality and the ghost of a crime scene.
And the first chilling realization for the police was that this quiet street where she was found, it probably wasn't where the attack actually happened.
Exactly. They believed almost immediately it was a secondary location, a dump site, which, makes finding evidence of the killer much, much harder. But the state of her body, it told a story of extreme violence.
The official cause of death was strangulation.
Yes, but the medical examiner's report detailed much more. She'd been raped. She'd been severely beaten, suffering blunt force trauma that caused terrible internal injuries, including a lacerated liver. This wasn't quick. It suggests a sustained, furious assault.
And the strangulation itself. The detail about the ligature is particularly disturbing.
It is. It wasn't a rope or a belt brought by the killer. It was the drawstring from her own sweatshirt. The killer had apparently pulled her sweatshirt up around her arms and then used its drawstring, knotted tightly around her neck and face, to kill her.
God, that's personal, intimate in the most horrific way.
It speaks to a certain level of control, maybe rage, and adding to that sense of violation, her personal items, her wallet, her bra, which was torn, her underwear, they weren't just discarded, they were found stuffed into the pocket of her jeans.
What does that suggest? Covering tracks or something more?
Yeah, performative. It's hard to say definitively. It could be a clumsy attempt to gather potential evidence, or it could be a deliberate act of humiliation, of dehumanization. Remember, the eventual conviction was for felony murder, with the rape being the underlying felony. So the state of her clothing was significant.
And then there was that other detail that really caught the public's attention, the reported pose of the body, the Christ-like pose.
Right, arms outstretched, legs crossed. That image, whether accurate or not, definitely fueled speculation early on. People wondered if it was ritualistic, if the killer was sending some kind of message.
But there was clarification on that later.
Yes, some sources suggest that might have just been how she was positioned by the paramedics trying to perform CPR before she was officially pronounced dead. It's hard to know for sure, but the image stuck and added another layer of horror.
Amidst all this horror and confusion, though, the medical examiner noticed something small but potentially critical.
Yes. On the sides of Mia's nipples, there were abrasions. The ME suspected they were caused by teeth bite marks. And, crucially, they took forensic swabs from those areas right away.
Swabs that would become everything eventually, but not in 1993.
Not at all. This is where you hit the limits of forensic science at the time. The swabs went straight to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab. The bad news? No semen detected. That would have been the gold standard then for getting a DNA profile.
But the good news?
Saliva. They did detect saliva on those nipple swabs. It wasn't enough for the older DNA methods, like RFLP, which needed a pretty substantial sample. But the saliva was there. That microscopic trace was carefully collected, preserved, and filed away.
So police are dealing with a likely dump site, not the primary crime scene, and a biological sample they can't really use yet. Detective Tom Pike said it really hampered the investigation from the start.
It absolutely did. The lack of a clear scene meant they, and the private investigator Lee Heron, who was hired by the community, had to chase down several leads, several theories, none of which really panned out in those first few years, say 93 to 98.
What were the main theories they pursued initially?
Well, one theory, pushed pretty hard by the PI Lee Heron, focused on the cab driver. Mia didn't drive, often took cabs, knew some drivers. Heron wondered if maybe Mia, who was known for being outspoken, might have gotten into an argument with a driver she knew, and it escalated violently.
Did they find any cab driver who picked her up that night?
No. They interviewed numerous drivers trying to track her potential route home, but nobody reported picking her up. No solid leads there.
Okay, what else?
Theory 2 centered on the street encounter, but miles away from where she was found. Near the reservoir on 11th Street, which is maybe 3 miles from the dump site, Heron's team found a man who claimed he heard this absolutely terrifying scream around that time. He ran outside but saw nothing.
Could they ever link that scream to Mia?
No, they couldn't definitively connect it. It was compelling, disturbing, but ultimately just another frustrating dead end.
And the third theory hit closer to home, didn't it?
Yeah, this one must have been particularly tough for her friends and bandmates. The studio friend's apartment theory. It came up because the day after the murder, someone found Mia's personal microphone and a Gits demo tape inside the rehearsal studio downstairs from TV's apartment.
Things she supposedly never let out of her sight.
Exactly. She was very protective of that mic especially. So the question arose, did she ever actually leave the building? Did she go back downstairs after visiting TV? Maybe something happened there. But again, no concrete evidence emerged.
So with all these leads going cold, what was the prevailing police belief?
The police pretty much concluded it had to be a random attack, a stranger abduction. And you have to understand what that conclusion meant for the Seattle scene, especially for women.
It shattered that sense of safety.
Completely. There was this feeling, maybe unspoken, within that punk and grunge community, that they were tough, they were loud, maybe somehow invulnerable, as one person put it. They didn't see themselves as potential victims. Mia's death, being deemed random, was this brutal reality check. It meant anyone could be next. The fear became palpable.
But that fear didn't lead to paralysis. It actually sparked this incredible wave of action. Which takes us to Section 2, the legacy of grief, activism, and the cold case.
Yeah, the response was immediate and fierce. The Seattle Times wrote that the murder robbed the scene of its sense of invincibility. But instead of retreating, the community mobilized.
The fundraising effort alone was remarkable. We're talking about the giants of the scene stepping up.
Absolutely. Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, Joan Jett. Huge names. They organized benefit concerts, donated money, and together they raised an astonishing $70,000.
Just incredible. And that money went directly to fund the investigation.
Primarily, yes. It was used to hire that private investigator, Lee Heron, to keep the pressure on, to pursue leads the police might not have had the resources for. It was a powerful statement. We are not letting this go.
But the activism went beyond just finding the killer, didn't it? It addressed that fear directly.
It did. Women in the music scene, artists, friends, they started meeting, talking. And what came out of those conversations was this urgent need for practical, affordable self-defense resources that actually fit their lives.
What was wrong with the existing options?
They felt the traditional self-defense classes were often unrealistic or even kind of victim-blaming. They'd get advice like, dress conservatively, don't walk alone at night.
Which for musicians working late, bar staff finishing shifts, people living alternative lifestyles, that advice is just useless.
Totally unhelpful. They needed skills that worked for them, for their reality. And that need, born directly from the trauma of Mia's murder, led to the creation of Home Alive.
The nonprofit organization.
Exactly. Home Alive started offering self-defense training specifically designed for those real-world situations, crucially on a sliding scale fee system. So it wasn't just for people who could afford expensive classes. It was about empowering the entire community, turning that collective grief into tangible, lasting action. It's an amazing legacy.
Meanwhile, the music community also made sure Mia's own voice wasn't silenced.
No, her bandmates, the Gits, they somehow found the strength to finish and release their final album, Enter, The Conquering Chicken, in 1994. It was a posthumous release, ensuring her last work was heard.
And Joan Jett's involvement was huge too, wasn't it? Beyond just fundraising.
Oh, massively symbolic and practical. Joan Jett, a rock icon, teamed up with the surviving Gits members. They recorded a live album and even toured under the name Evil Stig.
Evil Stig gets live backwards.
Exactly. And all the money raised from that project went straight back into funding the investigation into Mia's murder. It was this incredible act of solidarity.
And other tributes kept her memory alive too.
Yeah, friends of hers, the band 7 Year Bitch, they released an album called Viva Zapata in her honor. And Joan Jett also worked with Kathleen Hanna from Bikini Kill on a song called Go Home.
That was on Jett's Pure and Simple album.
Right, 1994. And the music video for Go Home was very direct. It actually showed a woman fighting off an attacker, successfully defending herself. It felt like a direct nod to the spirit of Home Alive, putting that empowerment message out there visually.
So all this effort, all this passion, the PI, the fundraising, the tributes, but the case itself just stalled.
It did. By 1998, 5 years on, a Seattle detective basically had to admit to the press we're no closer to solving this. It was heartbreaking. The case did get national exposure features on Unsolved Mysteries, America's Most Wanted. But nothing broke. The killer remained a ghost.
A ghost who would stay hidden for another 5 years, until technology finally caught up. Which brings us to Section 3, the DNA needle in the trillion haystack.
This part of the story is just. It's pure cold case dedication meets scientific breakthrough. You have to give immense credit to the Seattle PD cold case detectives, Richard Gagnon and Greg Mixell.
They decided to revisit the evidence in 2001, almost a decade later.
Yes. They pulled those original 1993 swabs, the ones taken from the suspected bite marks on Mia's nipples, the ones that only showed saliva back then, and they resubmitted them to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab. It was a long shot, but technology had evolved dramatically.
What specific techniques made the difference this time?
Two main things: PCR, polymerase chain reaction, and STR, short tandem repeat methodology. PCR was the game changer for tiny or degraded samples. Think of it like a genetic photocopier. It could take just a few cells of DNA from that old saliva sample and replicate them millions, even billions of times until you get enough material to actually analyze.
So PCR basically rescued that tiny sample from being unusable.
Pretty much. And once they had enough amplified DNA, they used STR analysis. Instead of looking at the whole genome, STR focuses on these specific, short, repeating sequences of DNA. These regions vary hugely between people, but don't actually code for traits, so they're great for identification.
How does that create a unique profile?
By looking at the number of repeats at multiple specific locations, usually 13 or more, now often over 20 scientists create a numerical profile. The combination of repeat counts across all these locations is statistically unique. So unique, in fact. Well, the results here were mind-blowing.
What did they find on those swabs in 2001?
They got 2 complete DNA profiles present in equal concentration. One was Mia Zapata's. The other belonged to an unknown male. That saliva sample, preserved for 8 years, finally yielded the killer's genetic fingerprint.
Incredible. So now they have this unknown male profile. What's the next step?
The next step is CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. In June 2002, they uploaded this unknown male STR profile into the national database.
Explain COD is for people who might not know. It's not like a database with names and photos, right?
No, exactly. CODIS is essentially a massive library of these numerical DNA profiles. It contains profiles from convicted offenders, which varies by state law in which offenses qualify, sometimes arrestees, and profiles from unsolved crime scene evidence, like the one from Mia's case. The system constantly compares new entries against the existing database, looking for matches.
So they upload the profile in June 2002 and wait.
6 months of waiting.
Yeah.
Imagine the tension for those detectives.
Yeah.
And then, December 2002, they get the notification. A hit. A match.
And the statistics on that match.
Astronomical. The frequency of that specific DNA profile occurring randomly in the U.S. population was estimated at 1.5 trillion. It's a number so large it essentially eliminates random chance. It's forensic certainty.
So who did the profile belong to?
A man named Jesus C. Mesquia. He was 48 years old at the time of the match, living in Miami, Florida, working as a fisherman, a Cuban national, completely off the radar in the original investigation.
Miami. How did his DNA even get into the system down there?
Pure chance, almost. In 2002, Mesquia was convicted in Florida for felony possession of burglary tools. Now, that might have been a misdemeanor in Washington, but it was a felony in Florida. And a condition of his probation for that felony was that he had to submit a DNA sample, typically a cheek swab.
So a relatively minor conviction in Florida, completely unrelated, is what ultimately linked him back to a murder in Seattle a decade earlier.
Precisely. The power of the national database. They quickly checked his history and confirmed he had lived in Seattle, specifically between 1992 and 1994. Right place, right time.
Where did he live in relation to Mia or the crime scene?
He lived about a mile and a half from 24th Avenue South, where Mia's body was found. And investigators also discovered that the woman he was living with at the time was out of town on the night of July 6, 1993. He had the opportunity.
So the net tightens. They locate him in Miami.
And in January 2003, nearly 10 years after Mia's death, Seattle detectives arrest Jesus Mesquia in Miami.
Did he confess? What did he say?
He was read his Miranda rights, and he did speak to the police. But he denied everything. Denied ever knowing Mia Zapata, denied ever having any contact with her, sexual or otherwise, which lined up with what Mia's friends and bandmates said none of them had ever heard of him or seen him before. It reinforced that random stranger theory.
But Mesquia wasn't just some random guy with no history, was he?
Far from it. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a really disturbing pattern of behavior, particularly violence towards women. There were documented incidents of domestic abuse, assault, battery, burglary charges involving ex-girlfriends and his wife. Multiple women had filed reports against him over the years.
Any history in Seattle specifically, besides living there?
Yes. Crucially, there was a report filed against him for indecent exposure in Seattle just weeks after Mia's murder. It painted a picture of someone with predatory tendencies.
So the prosecution's theories started to solidify.
Yeah, they portrayed Mesquia as this stalking lowlife. Someone who likely saw Mia walking alone late at night, abducted her, probably assaulted her in his car, given the lack of a primary crime scene, and then drove that mile and a half to dump her body on that isolated street. The DNA was the link, but his history provided the context.
The DNA evidence seems insurmountable, 1 in 1.5 trillion. But Mesquia pleaded not guilty, and it went to trial.
Which leads us to Section 4, the defense and the legal battles.
Right. Despite the DNA, the defense fought hard. Their main strategy wasn't really to contest the DNA match itself. How could they? Instead, they tried to create reasonable doubt by suggesting someone else committed the crime, an other suspect defense.
And their prime candidate for that was Mia's ex-boyfriend, Robert Jenkins.
Exactly. They hammered on those details from Mia's last hours, her anger towards Jenkins, the fact she was actively looking for him to confront him.
They also brought up that strange phone call he made the next morning, right? Yeah, the call to Mia's roommate, where he asked if Mia was there, and when told someone was in the shower, he apparently said something like, "It probably wasn't Zapata," which sounded suspicious, certainly.
And they tried to introduce testimony about past incidents.
They did. They wanted a friend to testify that Mia had said Jenkins could sometimes go crazy and had allegedly attacked her before. They were trying to paint him as a volatile alternative.
But the judge didn't allow most of this Jenkins evidence in.
No, the judge shut it down pretty decisively. There were several key reasons. First, the science. Jenkins had voluntarily provided a DNA sample early on, and he was definitively ruled out. His DNA did not match the profile on the swabs.
That's huge.
Massive. Second, his alibi held up. His girlfriend at the time confirmed she was with him that night. The defense couldn't break it. So the judge concluded there was simply no credible evidence, no step taken by him, as the judge put it, connecting Jenkins to the actual crime. It was speculation, not evidence.
So Jenkins was out. Did the defense have another potential suspect?
They considered it. They looked at a cab driver named Scott McFarlane. Apparently, he'd been working in the area that night, and about a year after the murder, he allegedly made some odd, incriminating statements about it. The court actually ruled, initially, that evidence pointing towards McFarlane could be presented by the defense.
Okay, so why didn't they present it? This seems like exactly what they needed.
Because this is where some high-stakes legal maneuvering came into play, revolving around evidence rules, specifically ER 404B, which deals with admitting evidence of prior bad acts. The prosecution had an ace up their sleeve.
What was it?
It was the testimony of another woman, Valentina DeCecco. She came forward during the trial with a story about Mesquia assaulting her in January 1994.
6 months after Mia's murder.
Exactly. And the details were chillingly similar to what likely happened to Mia. DeCecco said it was early morning, 4:30 a.m., downtown Seattle. Mesquia allegedly knocked her to her knees. She felt pain in her throat like she was being choked, and then he was found masturbating nearby.
Wow, that's a very specific, violent pattern.
Incredibly specific. And the state made it clear. If the defense introduced McFarlane as an alternative suspect, thereby putting Mesquia's identity as the killer directly at issue, the state would immediately seek to introduce DeCecco's testimony under ER 404B, not to show Mesquia was a bad person, but to show his specific identity or plan in committing this type of assault.
So the defense was caught. If they pointed the finger at McFarlane, the jury would hear this incredibly damaging story about Mesquia attacking another woman in a strikingly similar way.
Precisely. It was checkmate. The defense knew the DeCecco testimony would be devastatingly prejudicial, so they made a strategic calculation. They chose not to present the McFarlane evidence. They dropped that line of defense entirely to keep the DeCecco assault away from the jury.
A calculated gamble. Did that decision cause problems later on appeal?
It did, in a way. Mesquia's lawyers argued on appeal that the threat of the DeCecco evidence being admitted effectively prevented them from presenting a full defense, the McFarlane theory. But the appellate court disagreed. They said because the defense made a strategic choice not to introduce McFarlane, the DeCecco evidence was never actually ruled upon in that context, and therefore any harm was wholly speculative. You can't appeal based on evidence that was never presented due to your own tactical decision. It's similar to the loose rule in federal courts.
Fascinating legal strategy. Okay, besides the other suspect theories, did the defense challenge the DNA itself?
They did, on constitutional grounds. They argued Mesquia's Fourth Amendment right against unreasonable searches and seizures was violated. Their point was about how his DNA got into CODIS in the first place, that Florida probation requirement for the burglary tools conviction.
How is that potentially illegal?
Their argument was complex. They essentially claimed that while Florida law might allow DNA collection for that felony probation, Washington state law at the time might not have permitted collecting DNA under similar circumstances. They argued that Florida's collection, therefore, violated Washington standards and shouldn't be admissible in a Washington court.
So Florida got the DNA legally under Florida law, but Washington shouldn't be allowed to use it.
That was the gist. But the courts rejected this argument based on something called the silver platter doctrine.
Okay, what's the silver platter doctrine?
It basically says that if evidence is obtained lawfully by authorities in one jurisdiction, like Florida police following Florida law, it can be admitted in another jurisdiction, like Washington State Court, even if the second jurisdiction's own rules might have prevented its collection by its own officers. The key is that the evidence wasn't obtained illegally in the first place where it was gathered.
So Florida didn't break any Florida laws getting the sample.
Correct. Florida appellate courts had already upheld the legality of their DNA collection law. Mesquia's lawyers tried one more angle, arguing that Washington's mere participation in the National CODIS database amounted to inappropriate cooperation with Florida, suggesting Washington was somehow using CODIS to get around its own potentially stricter state laws.
Did that fly?
No. The court found no evidence that Washington authorities had somehow prompted or participated in the initial collection in Florida. Florida acted independently under its own laws. Washington simply received the benefit of that lawfully obtained data through the national system. So the DNA evidence, the linchpin of the case, stood firm against all challenges.
Which cleared the path for the verdict. Section V, conviction, sentencing, and those darker theories that linger.
On March 25, 2004, after hearing all the evidence and the failed defense arguments, the jury returned its verdict, guilty of first-degree felony murder.
I read there were shouts of Viva Zapata in the courtroom, a huge moment of release for everyone who'd waited so long.
Absolutely. Over 10 years of waiting. The trial judge then imposed a sentence that went beyond the standard range, based on the aggravating factor of deliberate cruelty, reflecting the brutality of the crime. Mesquia was sentenced to 440 months. That's 36 years. The standard range was more like 20 to 27 years, 240, 320 months.
A significantly longer sentence, reflecting the horrific nature of the crime. But that sentence didn't initially stick, did it?
No, it hit a major legal snag almost immediately. The Washington Court of Appeals upheld the conviction itself, but they reversed the exceptional sentence. This was because of a landmark U.S. Supreme Court decision that came down in 2004 called Blakely v. Washington.
Right, Blakely. That case had huge repercussions for sentencing everywhere. What was the issue here?
Blakely affirmed a defendant's Sixth Amendment right to have a jury, not a judge, decide any fact, other than prior convictions, that increases the penalty for a crime beyond the prescribed standard range. In Mesquia's case, the finding of deliberate cruelty was made by the judge to justify the longer sentence.
But under Blakely, that finding had to be made by the jury.
Precisely. Since the jury hadn't specifically found deliberate cruelty beyond a reasonable doubt as part of their verdict, using it to impose the exceptional 36-year sentence violated Mesquia's Sixth Amendment rights. So the sentence had to be vacated.
So justice seemed served, then partly undone by a constitutional ruling. How was it resolved?
It went back for resentencing. Mesquia actually chose to waive his right to have a jury decide on the aggravating factor this time. He let the trial judge reconsider it, and the judge, finding the evidence of deliberate cruelty overwhelming, again imposed the same 36-year sentence. This time, it stuck.
And Mesquia served that sentence.
He did. He was incarcerated and remained in prison until his death in January 2021. He was 66 years old. So although he lived free for that first decade after the murder, science and the justice system ultimately ensured he died behind bars for what he did.
Now, even with this conviction, based on DNA with odds of 1 in 1.5 trillion, that 10-year gap where the case was cold allowed some alternative, darker theories to fester, didn't it? We should probably touch on those just to acknowledge they're out there.
Yeah, it's important to address them, even if they're unverified and contradict the forensic evidence. Specifically, there were some very detailed claims made by someone named Leah Nichols, who described herself as a close friend of Mia's, even an understudy vocalist.
What was the core of her claims? It went against the random attack theory, right?
Completely. Nichols insisted the murder was not random. She proposed, quite explosively, that Mia might have actually been strangled by someone she knew, specifically naming a drug connection and bandmate, identified only as Maria, who Nichols alleged was a heroin dealer living near that reservoir where the scream was heard.
Or if Maria wasn't the killer, Nichols suggested Maria might have been an eyewitness.
Yes, Nichols claimed Maria might have actually seen Jesus Mesquia dragging Mia away, but then lied to the police about it.
What possible motive would Maria have had to lie or cover something like that up, according to Nichols?
Nichols theorized it was self-preservation, fear of social shame, exposure of her own alleged drug addiction, and potentially being blamed herself, especially if, as Nichols claimed, Mia was facing some kind of ultimatum from the band to quit the S or quit the band. Basically, Maria feared getting dragged into the whole mess.
Nichols even tried to link Mesquia, the convicted killer, to this alleged drug narrative.
She did. She claimed she met a man from Cuba who told her Mesquia had been a major heroin dealer back there, trying to forge some kind of prior connection between the killer and the supposed bandmate dealer, Maria. She also made other personal claims, like Mia being secretly in love with someone else entirely, not Jenkins.
Okay, so you have these intricate alternative narratives running parallel to the official conviction. How do we understand these, especially when the DNA evidence is so strong?
Well, I think it speaks to the profound trauma and the psychological need for a narrative that makes sense, especially when a crime is so brutal and seems so random. For people very close to the victim, the idea of a senseless chance encounter can be almost unbearable. There's often this deep-seated urge to find connections, to believe there must have been a deeper reason, a conspiracy, something that explains the why beyond just monstrous chance.
So even definitive forensic proof might not satisfy that emotional need for a complete, understandable story.
Sometimes not. It's the human mind trying to impose order on chaos. These unverified theories, while not supported by the evidence that led to the conviction, reflect that ongoing struggle to process an incomprehensible loss. But legally, scientifically, the case was closed by that DNA match.
A match found 10 years later thanks to preserved evidence and advancing technology. Which really brings us to the end, the final thoughts. The music endures.
It really does. This phantom homicide was ultimately solved not by a dramatic confession or a lucky break in the traditional sense, but by meticulous police work preserving that tiny saliva sample, and by scientific progress allowing that sample to finally speak.
And while Mia's life was tragically cut short, her death absolutely ignited something powerful. That legacy of activism, Home Alive specifically, is undeniable. It turned grief into concrete action that helped empower countless people.
Absolutely. And we're still left with that haunting question. What might have been? What music would Mia Zapata have created? Her bandmates, like Steve Moriarty, they believed the Gits would still be together, still touring, still recording. We lost not just a person, but decades of potential art.
Her father, Richard Zapata, offered such a poignant way to think about the loss, trying to cope. He said, "She was on loan to me, and she now belongs to all of you."
That's beautiful. It captures how her voice, her story, her fierce talent became this shared legacy, part of Seattle's music history forever, even though her own story ended far too soon.
Okay, so we hope you liked our today's discussion. For more such discussion, subscribe to our channel, Phantom Homicide.